There have been many biographies written about George Washington, very few by a woman. Joining me now, Alexis Coe. She's the author of the new Washington biography, You Never Forget Your First. This part of the book, which I loved, such a good book, was my favorite. When you would tell people you were writing a book about Washington, the conversation went like this. What's your book about? George Washington. His marriage? No. His wife? No. His social life? What changes when a woman writes a book like this?
I'm not obsessed with his manliness. I think that's a foregone conclusion. He's the great general. He won the war, a totally unpredictable outcome. I want to know who he was. I want to know what he did because he wasn't on the front lines. I want to know who raised him. That he was raised by a single mother is really compelling to me. What his interactions were like with his children. They weren't biological, but he had tons of them. That's what I'm interested in.
You don't get into this in the book, but I have to ask because it's a burning question after having read it, which is what would George Washington think of Donald Trump?
He would, I think, it's hard to say what would someone in the past think, but his farewell address seems oddly modern. He warns against foreign interference, that if you allow foreign countries to in any way help you, you will owe them something. And not only that, but rampant partisanship. If men only care about power, and he did, speak to men, that's all he envisioned for this country. If they only care about maintaining power, they will not serve the American public.
We were having a good laugh a few moments ago about what would happen if all of these guys would have been on Twitter, right?
Oh my goodness.
The John Adams Twitter account.
John Adams would have been blocked by everyone a long time ago. George Washington would send out one tweet every 7 months.
Right, exactly. He definitely would not have been
If that, absolutely. I mean, he never publicly commented on criticism. Never. And it did hurt him. Jefferson said he'd never seen anyone who was so sensitive, but he thought it was below the office.
Sensitivity, what an interesting thing to focus on. You had said earlier, too, that you weren't sure we needed more biographies of George Washington.
I think that what's so great about Alexis's book is that, we are fleshing out, a George Washington, giving a more honest portrait, a fuller portrait of who he really was as a person. And as somebody who lives in Philadelphia and is kind of walking around, living history every day, to be able to conceive of George Washington as a person, as opposed to this figure, that we see in these portraits all the time. Even just the cover, the thought of him having a personality and what that was like, I think is not something that you get typically from the biographies or how he's depicted in museums. It's a different way to frame the narrative about somebody who obviously most of us as American citizens learn about and think that we know.
You never forget your first, but you do misremember a lot of things.
Absolutely.
So what surprised you most in your writing of this?
I think, you bring up Philadelphia. And when you read biographies about George Washington, it seems as if he had one enslaved man by his side the whole time. But in fact, we know that he owned hundreds of people throughout his life. And that was really important to me to talk about how close, when you look at Mount Vernon, when you look at all these letters that he wrote home, it's always, it's conveyed as if he misses his home, he's really into whatever, construction is being done. No, he's into his workforce and maximizing profit, because he was, in fact, a businessman. And that is how he produced so much tobacco, whiskey, other goods that were essential that made him at the forefront of business. He was, in fact, one of the biggest whiskey distillers in the country. And in Philadelphia, where the second president's house was, they had a law. If you had slaves there for more than 6 months, they were free. And so Washington, very openly in his letters, and he did edit them, so he wanted us to know this. He wasn't ashamed of it. He had them rotated out every 6 months right before. And if anyone knew, if they got an inkling of this, he said, send them back to Mount Vernon.
Because you were very clear that in as much as this is about also reimagining the role that women played during this period of time, it's also about really confronting the whitewashing that has gone on in the recounting of this history.
Absolutely. And speaking of women, I'm sure you must know the story of the one woman that did get away, that he chased down for the rest of his life.
Oh, and a judge. And that's a really important story that we talk about. There's this, so this is a fully formed human, right? So it's not really that I'm just focusing on the women. I'm focusing on every part of his life, like as if I really just had to sort of cut everything down and start anew. And what I realized was, this story that we get served, that during the revolution he fought with black soldiers and that changed his mind. He had this change of heart that led to his final act of emancipating his slaves was absolutely not true, because he was chasing many of them until, months before his death. He rewrote a will the summer before he died. He died in December. That's essential for us to know. And it's people he met during the revolution, like Lafayette, famous from the Hamilton musical, who spent decades writing to him and saying, please do this, set an example while you're alive for this infant nation. It could change everything. And he didn't. He would say, you're so sweet. So when we say he was a man of his time, yes, but he wasn't blind to these things. He understood. And that final act was significant to the people who he emancipated, but they were also separated from their families, and he did wait until he didn't have to deal with the consequences.
We have about 30 seconds left, but I have to ask you, would Washington recognize the presidency today?
He would think it was, he would think that we might need another revolution. He was a reluctant revolutionary. He was a planter from Virginia. It was because he couldn't maximize his business, and also because he felt like, he wasn't being heard, and that the powers to be only cared about a certain type of person. And so I think he would feel as if we had let institutions become corrupt and decay.
Alexis, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. And my panel, Hayes, Erin, Gabby, thank you all so much. That wraps it up for this hour. I'm Alicia Menendez. I'll be back tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern. Coming up at the top of the hour, Politics Nation with